Hi everyone, this is the second tutorial for the test bed. By now you have assembled your test bed and you're ready to move on and practice programming. So you've become familiar with the sensors, the line tracker, the limit switch, the button switch, and the potentiometer. You've attached motors, and now you're going to program to have the sensors collect information and have the motors or the LED be an output. So let's take a look. Become familiar with this document. Put the tutorials on the top, some information. I'm going to talk about this next. Here, a checklist, a summary of how to designate motors and sensors, and then the last pages are your sample code. So we are going to talk about each of these, but first let's start with talking about how to log on and log off the computers. It's very important that you log on and log off the computers. When you get the MacBook, it should be powered on. So please tap some keys on the keyboard, click the trackpad a few times, and wait up to 30 seconds to see if the screen wakes up out of sleep mode. Otherwise, you may be powering it down if you hit the power key. Should never power down the MacBooks. Should never really be clicking the power button at all. That can possibly damage the hard drive. So please wait for it to wake out of sleep mode. If you're confident that it is indeed off, that's when you should use the power button. When you open the screen and you see a log on screen, it will probably have another user there. So the first step is to click switch user. And when you click switch user, I believe what you do next is new user, something like that. So you'll click switch user and then select new user, and you'll enter your username, which is typically the first initial last name, or it's like the first part of your email address. Do not include @Hillers. And then your password should be 2021. You must log off when you're done using the MacBook. And I've put a little image here so you can consult, but let me just show you quickly. When you're done using the computer, you close out of Windows, close out of ROBOTC, which is the software, and then you click here. You do not shut down. You click this and then log off. Please make sure you do that responsibly and properly at the end of class. Okay, now that we've talked about logging in and logging off, you need to make sure you are taking the correct number MacBook that you have been assigned. On the top of the laptop cart, there are papers. I know this is just one specific class, but your class list is on top of the MacBook cart as well. You need to look for it, find your name, find your class, find your name, and then you are assigned a number alphabetically. That's the number MacBook you should take. You will be saving work to these MacBooks, so it's important you take the same one each time. While I'm talking about some good practices here, I do also want to remind you at the end of class, let me just scroll up here, be sure to find on your cortex or your brain the on-off button. And at the end of every class, you should power down your brain. Otherwise, it will drain your battery. And you may come to class, the following class, with a dead battery, and you'll need to either find a charged battery or wait for it to charge. So another best practice is learning where the on-off button is on the cortex or the brain and powering down at the end of every class. But I will remind you of that. All right, so we're ready to access the software. The software is called ROBOTC. You may see it here a few times. So let's look at ROBOTC on the desktop. You double-click the icon and it should open. And then we'll talk about a few settings that will need to be adjusted. All right, so you can close out of this window or leave it open. I usually like to close out of it. And then I'm going to go to the Robot tab at the top and choose Platform Type. There are two settings I need to change, or actually, you may need to change or make sure that VEX 2.0 Cortex is selected. I believe you can change it here or here. Just make sure it's selected in both places, platform type, and then make sure natural language PLTW is selected. So VEX 2.0 Cortex, VEX 2.0 Cortex, and make sure this is selected, natural language PLTW. Once those are selected, we're now going to make sure our firmware is up to date. So you'll still go to the robot menu, download firmware, manually update firmware, and we will start with the master CPU firmware standard file. Your brain does need to be powered on, so a good starting point would be to find that on-off switch on the brain or the cortex. If you get this message, you know your cortex is powered on. So the first firmware install is the CPU firmware, and the next one we will do is the ROBOTC firmware once this first one finishes. Great, thank you so much. Let's go back to the Robot tab, download firmware, manual, ROBOTC is at the top, standard file. All right, now I'm going to go back to robot. Yep, robot one more time. And the communication mode, make sure your communication mode is set to USB only. That's very important, so make sure that's selected. And then one last thing is if you look on the left here and you do not see these options, just go back to robot platform type and make sure you have the 2.0 in both places and the natural language PLTW. You might have to adjust that one more time. All right, so we've talked about firmware platform type as well as communication mode. That was what we did over here, USB only. Those are all summarized in your checklist here. I don't know if this one, just make sure you're in the correct version. I think we deleted those, but make sure. Using an orange cord, powered on the brain, motor controllers, updated. We just talked about that. Platform type, communication mode. We talked about all of that, and we will get to motors and sensors. But I just wanted to let you know I did summarize that here in a checklist. So let's move back to ROBOTC and talk about designating motors and sensors. If you say File, New File, where we'll make some code, and then you can go to Motors and Sensors Setup. If you look on your brain or your cortex, there are 3 different types of ports. There are motor ports, there are analog ports, and there are digital ports. If you have not yet plugged sensors, motors, LEDs into your ports, please make sure you are careful and that you watch. I must have lost it. Let me see if I can get back here. Who's this guy? Sorry, thought I had it up. It's number 13 here, where he talks about, we don't need to hear him though, how to plug into the ports. So I will talk about specific ports, but make sure you are very careful when you plug in. If you jam sensors or motors into these ports, it will break, okay, or they will break, and that's not okay. So if at any point you do not know how to do this, you need to ask or watch video 13 carefully, okay? If you're unsure, don't do it so you don't break stuff. Awesome, okay. So I believe you guys have 2 motors. So let's say we're going to put abbreviations and names. So let's say motor 1 and motor 2. And you'll skip port 1 and start with port 2. I'm approaching my 10-minute maximum here, so I will record a part 2 where I continue talking about how to designate these and doing some sample code, and I'll see you guys back in part 2. See ya.